The regular iPhone 16 is no doubt the better upgrade this year with its beautiful camera redesign and fresh colors compared to the 16 Pro, which basically looks the same as before. But if you choose the regular 16, just how much are you truly missing out in terms of the cameras? Well, in this video, I went out and took a ton of photos with the iPhone 16 Plus and the Pro Max to show you every single difference, including some that nobody else had mentioned before. So let's get started. So here are the first pictures, and you might see that there's absolutely no difference, and you're right. Both of these are 48 megapixel, but here is where I noticed a little bit of a difference. The iPhone 16 Pro resorts to 24 millimeters, the 16 which starts at 26 millimeters. So when I was taking these photos, the framing was a little bit off and I couldn't figure out why until I looked into the settings. So essentially the iPhone 16 Pro has a wider camera, and when zoomed in, absolutely no difference there. And here is the first portrait shot, and what's really interesting here is that I am standing in the same exact position. On the 16 Pro, we got a wider shot, which is really interesting. And here's the first selfie, and obviously there's not a single difference in the front camera just yet. And when taking another portrait here with the same regular 48 megapixel camera, they look identical. But here is where the iPhone 16 Pro shines. The 5x camera is beautiful. It actually looks like a DSLR camera, versus on the iPhone 16, you actually have to get closer, but the background gets really distracting. And here's that example of getting too close. On the right here on the 16 Pro, you can obviously see that his face looks natural, it is not wide, his ears are gone, and his face just doesn't look natural. So the 5x is definitely the next step up on these cameras. And here's a quick example during the night, just how much framing you need in order to get the pictures to look the same. On the left, we have the trees that are fully in focus, and it just takes away from the subject. And when I frame them in the same position as the 5x, it just looks terrible. And moving on, this motorcycle looks pretty cool. And the one thing that I noticed is that because the iPhone 16 has the 26 millimeter, means it's shooting a little bit closer, you have nicer blur effect, which I thought was really interesting. And here is the first ultra wide picture. Because Apple advertised that the ultra wide is now 48 megapixels on the 16 Pro, I wanted to test out and see if there are more details in these photos. And using the 1x, these pictures look essentially the same. But here is where we see the bigger difference. The iPhone 16 Pro obviously has the 5x telephoto camera, and when zooming in and cropping in, this is crazy. I can actually see my wife's face in this picture versus the one on the iPhone 16. So if you're at a little further distance and taking a picture, you will see a big difference in terms of quality. And here's our dog Toby. I took this clip while we were on a walk. This is him running towards us, and you can almost not see a difference here. And when we zoom in, we can see that the dynamic range on the Pro Max is a lot better. And the details in his whiskers definitely look much nicer than the iPhone 16. But in perfect lighting conditions, to me, it doesn't seem like a very big difference. And here is a great example of zooming in. The iPhone 16 Pro with the 5x versus the iPhone 16 with the 2x. But when we punch it in and frame it up, you can see a huge difference on that building. So the 5x is definitely a really nice addition to the 16 Pros. And in this picture with soft lighting inside of a store, you can see that it just does a better job. Punching in, the 5x again did a really good job, and punching in further, you can actually read the text on the iPhone 16 Pro, versus on the iPhone 16, you can barely see the text on that book. And here's an indoor shot using the 2x on both of these cameras, and in this scenario, I don't see a difference yet, but punching in on the iPhone 16 Pro, the quality of the picture is just slightly better. And here is another 4K 120 versus 1080p. And from this position, you can barely tell a difference, but when punching in, you can see that the numbers are a little bit punchier, so there definitely is a difference. So here's a picture if you want to capture an action shot. There was a small plane flying and I wanted to see what it was, and on the iPhone 16 you can't even tell what it is, and even the color. But on the iPhone 16 Pro, and when punching in, Wow, the difference is crazy. Yes, it's not perfect because you are zooming in 10, 15, 25x versus on the 16, you are locked into the 1x camera. And here's a picture of our neighbor's horse, and you can definitely tell a difference there with the zoom levels. And here's a picture of our dog using the digital zoom on the iPhone 16, and it just looks terrible. And with this waterfall, same thing with the 16 Pro, it just looks nicer when zoomed in. And moving on to macro mode, they look very similar to me. I essentially see no difference here in terms of quality, even though the iPhone 16 Pro shoots at 48 megapixels. When you look in the settings of the image, it defaults to 12 megapixels, which is super strange, but in this picture you can definitely tell a difference in terms of the color and the sharpness on the 16 Pro, which looks much nicer. And with the regular ultra wide pictures, here you can see a huge difference. And in perfect lighting and conditions, you can definitely tell that the 48 megapixel camera is actually doing its job. When zooming in, you can definitely tell a huge difference in terms of quality. On the iPhone 16 Pro, you can see the detail in the bricks and the blinds where you can definitely see a higher picture quality. But the crazy thing is, when I went inside my vehicle, I tried to take a picture of the steering wheel, and look what it did. It completely blew out the background with its dynamic range. I have no clue why it's doing this, and when you reframe and still focus on the steering wheel, it does not change. My thought is that the 48 megapixel on the ultra wide has worse dynamic range than on the iPhone 16, which is just crazy. And this is a portrait of our dog, and the sun is going down, so it's getting a lot darker. And here it does a fantastic job on both of them. And here's a 2x with lower lighting. And when zooming into the 5x telephoto or going further, which on the iPhone 16 Pro, you can zoom up to 25x. And when we match the framing, it is just unusable on the iPhone 16. Here is a regular 1x shooting against the sun, which is a very difficult picture to take. And the iPhone 16 actually did a pretty good job. Yes, the sun is blown out on the iPhone 16, but on the iPhone 16 Pro, it is much darker. And here's where it gets interesting. The iPhone 16 and 16 Pro have the same lens, but this is where I saw a huge difference. This is the same 1x, but cropped in, and there is a ton of noise on the iPhone 16 versus the 16 Pro, which should not be happening because they are the same lenses, but there is a difference. And here's that ultra wide during our practice, and the iPhone 16 actually did a better job on this one. And this is a 5x on both, but obviously the iPhone 16 just can't get that quality that the 5x on the 16 Pro can. And here is a portrait selfie, and the iPhone 16 looks a little bit better on this one. And here's another zoom shot in tough lighting conditions with lots of lights in the background. This is the 5x on both of them, and because of the digital zoom on the iPhone 16, you can definitely see more detail here in Kenny's face, whereas the iPhone 16 just blurs it out. Here's that same scenario with the Froyo Earth sign 5x versus 5x on the 16, and it just looks much nicer on the 16 Pro. When shooting ultra wide in lower conditions, both of these were at 12 megapixels, and surprisingly, the one on the iPhone 16 brought the picture up a little brighter, but on the iPhone 16 Pro, it just looks more balanced, and if you notice on the lights, they don't look as washed out compared to the iPhone 16. So the iPhone 16 Pro, even in the 12 megapixel settings, looks a little bit nicer. And when taking a picture at a very bright light, you can notice that there's a little difference in the reflection here. The iPhone 16 Pro has these prominent 3 flares that come up, and it just looks kind of distracting, whereas on the iPhone 16 it smooths it out and it just looks a little nicer. But the background on the 16 Pro looks much nicer. And here's where we can see a big difference. The iPhone 16 does not have a night mode portrait, whereas the iPhone 16 Pro has that LiDAR sensor that is very good at detecting how far the subject is away from the camera. And here you can just see a big difference. In terms of her shirt, you can see that there is definitely a lot more details, and in the face, it just looks much nicer on the 16 Pro versus the 16. But here is where I was surprised. when I went home and took these macro photos in a very dark environment, for whatever reason, the iPhone 16 did a much nicer job. You can see a lot more detail here in the little lemon, and it just looks much nicer. Here's that same ultra wide, and it looks like it's a little bit blown out here on the iPhone 16 versus the 16 Pro, where it just kept the whole picture balanced. And going outside, this is a 5x telephoto, and you can definitely see more detail in these night shots compared to the iPhone 16. And here's the final picture of this comparison, and this was a 30-second night shot, and the iPhone 16 Pro added this vignette right here, which is really interesting versus on the iPhone 16. It just made the whole sky one gradient, but in terms of the quality, they look identical. So with all of that said, even though it seems like the iPhone 16 is the one to buy, the iPhone 16 Pro models are clearly the ones you should be buying if you really care about the camera quality, because that 5x lens is a game changer in terms of not only zoom quality and professional looking 5x portraits, but also some of those other differences as well, like having LiDAR for night mode shots and much more. But if you really don't care that much about portraits or zoom photos, I'd say the iPhone 16 is definitely a good buy this year. So hopefully you enjoyed this video, and if you did, go ahead and subscribe above and check out our blind camera test right over there. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.